Hello and welcome to this video in the series Patterns in Action, and I hope this will bring more attention to this series, and hopefully I'll be adding more videos to it in the future. And in this video we're going to have a look at an instructive king and pawn endgame. King and endgame. Ting pinga pawn endgame. King and pawn endgame. Now, this was submitted a few days ago on the chess forum on Reddit, 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 and yeah, from a user who has been posting puzzles like this, and I found it highly interesting. And what I did was, sometimes when I go to sleep, I memorize a position and try to solve it, and couldn't solve it in the first go, but was happy to do so in the second go. And it's a very good puzzle because it's there's many themes that are quite important for king and pawn endgames. Now let's have a look at the position and try to evaluate what's going on. First thing we'll notice is that the pawn count is equal. Both sides have 6 pawns. However, white does have these rather ugly looking double pawns. Black's main asset is his e pawn, and of course also he has double pass pawn, which is quite strong. Looking at this, the only real asset I can come up with for white is this passed h pawn. And that's the first pattern that sort of, haunts me. If white can't use the passed h pawn, most likely it's going to be lost. So the first move that comes to mind immediately is h4. A move like king d3. Well, try and block from going king e4. Might make sense on some level, but c5 followed by c4 only helps black. He gets a tempo with the pawn here, comes to c4, and the king will get the e4 square anyway. So it's clear that we have to start with h4. It's also clear that since our pawns here are kind of devalued here on the queen side, that one passed pawn might not be enough. So things have to happen immediately. If black was to move and could, say, play c5, well, he would play king e4, of course, but let's imagine our king somewhere else. And he could play c5 and bring his king around to this side of the board. White can only make one passed pawn, so he would just pick it up eventually and win the game with his double connected passed pawns. So we have to play h4. And okay, we're threatening h5. What to do? King e4. Makes sense. Black wants to pick up the pawns here, start capturing, and if we do nothing, then we simply lose. So we have to try and make a pass pawn, h5. Now the black king must get a passage to block this pawn, so he has to take to create this f5 square. And note, we don't have any time for to go back shenanigans like f5. I believe we might be able to even take here. King takes e5, and once we go for h5, he simply takes, and we're not making a pass pawn here. The king is safely in the square of the pawn. He will pick up the pawn. For clarification, the square of the pawn is this square right here. Also, after h5 takes, there's no time for f5, we can transpose to the other variation, play king takes e5, and I don't see any tricks here. So g takes h5. Okay, king f5. And what to do now? Well, the most natural move is to bring the king forward, king d3. And yeah, before we go on, I would like to talk about these two pawns here, the double A pawns that I have circled here. What does this pattern mean? What is the first thing that comes to the mind of a master once he gets such a position? To a master, this pattern simply means a tempo for white. Okay, it's a bad pawn structure, but going forward in the position, the master will think this is a free tempo. Fair enough. How can we use that? Well, let's first try king d3. We're attacking this pawn. And another pattern actually in the current position is this one. The one we circled here. So if you imagine no other pawns on the board, then this construction is very good for white because it limits the king. The king can't go after the f pawn because then the h pawn will run. As soon as the king tries to walk over to the h pawn, king f6, king g7, we advance the f pawn. In whichever pawn the king attacks, the other pawn runs. So this is a very important pattern to know. These two pawns will hold up the king. This you must know. So once we get here, we know that the black king is held up here, and the only way to free the king is to go f6 at some point. First he must take care of the d pawn, so c5. And now we try king c4. But we soon realize that here black can go for the counterattack. King to e4. And this is dangerous. We can't allow this because, okay, h6, d3, both sides of the queen. In this position we're not winning. Okay, but what about the pattern I talked about before? The free tempo. Let's use it now. a6, b takes a6, a5. See what we did there? We had this position. Now we have this one. What's the difference? It's black to move. Very important. So we gain the tempo, black to move. We already know his king is tied up, so his only move is f6. And these pawns can't move. They're stuck, so let's make them yellow. So f6 the only move. Now we play h6, king g6. And what to do? Why do we play h6? Well, if we do nothing, if we take on f6, or we let him take on e5, then the thing that I talked about before will actually transpire. I think I had it. No, I deleted the arrows. I said if the black king can go around, we have only one passed pawn, he can simply pick up the pawn. So let's say we take, king takes. What's going to happen? This pawn is no longer passed because of this pawn. So the king will simply walk over here and pick up this pawn and then the other one. Meanwhile, these will keep our king tied up. So the other option is not to do anything, but that's not good either because now the king is safely in the square of the pawn again. He will catch the pawn here. Again, the circle is smaller, but well, circle the square, sorry. But we're still in it. We're going to win the pawn. So we have to try something, and the try is h6. Okay, king g6, try and stop the pawn. And now if he picks up the pawn, there's nothing to do. So now we come to another hugely important pattern. f5 check. And black must take on h6. If we take here, e6. We have another pattern. Another pattern, man. No, this one. No, this one. Yes. Another important pattern. Earlier we had this one. The pawns containing the king. Okay, it's good to know. It's containing the king. But this one, the white pawns, two falls apart there. The king, he just can't compete. Whichever pawn he captures, the other one runs. And this is more than containment, because if it's our move now, we play e7. The king comes to the e pawn. We play e7. It's not our move. Let's say f4. We play e7. He comes to the pawn. We go for the other one. So he can't contain both pawns. A very important pattern. So. Okay, king takes h6. E takes f takes e6. Excuse me. We're threatening the queen the pawn, so the king must once again enter the square. A very important concept. Okay, let's make this one yellow actually, because it's the yellow arrow is what good players use to help them identify the square. You just draw a diagonal arrow to the queen square, well, to the square on the 8th rank, and if the king hasn't reached that, then he's not in this square. It's just a quicker method that people use. So okay, king g7 entering the square. e7, again he must enter the square, king f7, but now e takes f6. And now we have another funky pattern. Not this one, kind of blew it there, but this one. And yeah, it's the same for both sides. The double pawns, they contain the king, but they cannot advance. So if nothing else was on the board, this would be a draw, unless we can somehow get to the final pattern, which is to try and mate the king. Use our more advanced pawns, abandon his pawns, and try and give checkmate. So let's try king c4. But what happens now? Let's play king d7. If we try to advance now, let's say king d5. There's d3. We can't reach e6. We need to reach e6 to threaten f7, but he's blocking us. Also, if we want to sacrifice the e pawn, we need our king on g7. So e8 queen, king takes, king's on g7, we have check, check. But of course, it's gonna take too many moves. We can't do that. So it's clear we can't abandon the c and d pawns for the g7 square, and we're not reaching the e6 square. So it becomes clear that we're lacking a tempo. Black is gonna go back and forth. And we're just too late. King d7 could also be played probably, but let's see here, d3. We're one move off. He's gonna queen with check, and this even loses. So in this position, let's go back. King c, king e8, king c4. Here we're stuck. We're just gonna go back and forth between these squares. It's a draw. We can't do anything. And black just goes back and forth. So we need a tempo somehow. And you have to go down this variation first to figure out the solution. And we have to go all the way back to this position. And this is how calculation works. You can't just, okay, I will pick some candidate moves here and calculate them. No, you have to. It's a flawed method, you know. Okay, it can help, But here you have to go down the most natural path, and there you find something wrong. You're like, oh, okay, I need a tempo. Okay, the tempo could be the pawns. We did use them, but then we needed another one. And here it is. Instead of king d3, we play king d2. Same situation. You can play c5 or f6, it doesn't matter. Let's play c5, king d3. Here's the tempo. And again, the king is tied up, so you have to play f6. Now we play h6. Same line as before. f5, he must take. f takes e6. King g6, e7, king f7, e takes f6, king e8. And now the big difference, king f7. And we have this mutual containment, but here we have our extra tempo, the pattern that we talked about, the pawns. This tempo right here, and now we're going to use it. a6, b takes a6, a5, black to move, which means we can actually take on c5, threatening the pawn, and once the pawn moves, we go king d6, and okay, our main threat is of course clear, but if it goes here, now we won a crucial tempo, e8 queen, now it's us queening with tempo, and if d2, we can execute this beautiful pattern here, this mating pattern, where the pawn will go to f7 on the next move, checkmate. And this, you'll see more than you'd think, so I think this is a pattern that you should know, definitely. So let's actually recap which patterns can we learn from this pretty little endgame study. Let's go back to the solution. h4, king e4, what else? Otherwise h5. h5 still, takes, king must block, now this important tempo. c5, king d3. Black must free himself with f6. We use our trump, h6. We give this check to get these dangerous passed pawns. Black tries to contain, but here we use our extra tempo, a6, a5. Then we use the final pattern here with the king on e6 and keep checkmate. So quick recap of the ideas. The first pattern that an experienced master will notice is the distant passed pawn. That's quite often the deciding factor in king and pawn endgames, the distant passed pawn. And it's just because that it's distant, so your opponent usually has to spend time to contain it, and that time you can use to pick up a pawn or create another passed pawn. The second pattern was these pawns. The double pawns, okay, in general are bad. In this case, they gave away double connected passed pawns. But again, these pawns represent a tempo in a king and pawn endgame. That's what an experienced master will see here. The third tempo was this containment pattern. Black king can't capture the pawns contain the king on the f5 square. The pawns, however, cannot move independently forward unless black tries to. So black could actually go here, king f6, king f5, back and forth if there was nothing else on the board. But the pawns contain the king. Next pattern, these pawns are two files apart. They do more than contain. They beat the king. The king can't go after both of them if they're on the same rank. So it captures one, the other one runs. The pawns would actually have to go a little bit back for the king to be able to capture them. If they were actually on the 5th rank, you could capture and still be in the square of the pawn. So very important pattern there. And finally, well no, second to last, this is also a final one, but let's actually have a look at this one first. Mutual containment. The king can't get out of containing the pawns, but with one exception, if he can give away the promotion and gain something himself, either promote ahead of your opponent, like we did one time, the king on d7, the pawn on e8, or as in our final pattern, if you can get to e6 and get this bad king on e8, we can give away the promotion and play f7 checkmate on the next move. So that was a breakdown of this great puzzle. I hope there are some things there that you can pick up and learn, and I will see you later. Bye bye.